Harlem, December 13th, 1948, 9:47 p.m. The Unity Orphanage burned fast, too fast. Dr. Charlotte Hayes stood in the snow watching flames eat through the second-floor windows where 43 children had been sleeping 7 minutes ago. She'd gotten 41 out through the back door, dragging the youngest ones, shouting at the older ones to run, moving on pure adrenaline and terror. But Sarah and Thomas Reynolds, 7 and 9 years old, slept in the front room. By the time Hayes reached their door, the hallway was an inferno. She tried the knob, too hot to touch. She kicked the door. Solid oak wouldn't budge. Through the wood, she heard them screaming. Then she heard nothing. Fire trucks arrived at 10:03 p.m. By 10:47 p.m., firefighters pulled 2 small bodies from the wreckage, charred beyond recognition except for their size. Hayes identified them by their room location. She'd placed them there herself 3 days ago because Sarah was afraid of the dark and the front room had a street light outside the window. Captain Henry Vance arrived at 11:15 p.m. in a dress uniform that looked freshly pressed, smelling of expensive cologne. He questioned Hayes for 90 seconds, took notes without looking at her, then delivered his assessment to the gathering reporters. Tragic accident, faulty wiring in an old building. The colored community needs to maintain their facilities better. 2 children dead because of negligence. Hayes grabbed his arm. It wasn't faulty wiring. I saw men with gasoline cans. I saw them light it. This was arson. Vance removed her hand from his sleeve like she was contaminated. His voice dropped to a whisper only she could hear. "You're traumatized, Doctor. Your memory is unreliable. If you continue making false accusations, I'll charge you with interfering with an investigation. 2 dead is unfortunate. Don't make it 43. He smiled. Actually smiled. Then walked to his car and drove away. Hayes stood in the snow watching the orphanage collapse into itself, understanding with perfect clarity that Henry Vance had just threatened to kill 41 more children if she talked, that he'd murdered Sarah and Thomas and would face 0 consequences, that the system designed to protect people would protect him instead. Which is why, at 2:47 p.m. the next day, she walked into the Red Rooster Social Club, carrying a folder of photographs and asked to see Bumpy Johnson. December 18th, 1948, 11:00 p.m. Red Rooster back room. 23 men sat around a scarred table, listening to Bumpy Johnson describe how 2 children had burned to death, while a police captain smiled about it. Johnson was 43 years old, had killed 11 men personally, and ordered the deaths of maybe 40 more, controlled Harlem's policy operations that generated $2 million annually, and had survived every gang war since 1925 by being smarter and more ruthless than his enemies. He'd never killed a police captain before. That was a line even he hadn't crossed, because killing cops brought heat that destroyed organizations, because it triggered a response that couldn't be controlled or contained. But there were lines that mattered more than survival. Lines that once crossed required response regardless of cost. Henry Vance burned 43 children, Johnson said quietly. 41 survived, 2 didn't. Vance called it an accident, blamed it on faulty wiring, threatened Dr. Hayes when she said it was arson. Yesterday, he gave an interview saying the tragedy proved colored people can't manage their own institutions properly. Johnson opened Hayes's folder, spread photographs across the table. two small shapes under white sheets, a burned building, evidence markers that would never be followed up on. Vance is also the Grand Dragon of New York's KKK klavern, Johnson continued. Theodore's sources confirm it. He's been planning a major operation against our policy banks for Christmas Eve. Not arrests, raids designed to destroy our infrastructure and terrorize the community. Vance intends to do to our entire organization what he did to that orphanage. Prophet Washington, a 52-year-old veteran who'd fought in France in 1918 and in Harlem streets ever since, spoke carefully. "We kill a police captain, the entire NYPD comes for us. This could destroy everything we've built. Only if they investigate," Johnson said. "Only if Vance's death becomes a problem for the police department instead of a problem they want buried. Which is why we're not going to kill him like we'd kill a rival gangster. We're going to kill him in a way that forces them to cover it up." For 2 hours, Johnson laid out a plan so audacious that even men who'd known him for decades felt their calculations shift, felt the familiar weight of risk transform into something closer to certainty, felt the trap's elegant brutality snap into focus. The plan had 4 components. 1. The bait. Through carefully managed sources, a police informant, a captured runner who'd break under interrogation, witnesses who didn't know they were being manipulated, information would reach Vance about a massive heroin shipment. $5 million worth. Arriving Christmas Eve at an abandoned textile mill on East 135th. Too big to ignore, too tempting to report through official channels where he'd have to share the credit and the profit. 2. The ground. The textile mill was perfect, isolated, complex layout, no electricity, no nearby witnesses. Prophet Washington had spent 2 weeks transforming it into a 3-dimensional kill box. Temporary lights controlled from a central switch, elevated firing positions, drums of gasoline positioned to create walls of fire. Floor sections weakened to collapse under running men, steel cables at neck height in corridors, false heroin crates filled with powdered sugar positioned as obvious bait in the center of the main floor. 3. The Judas. Raymond Quick. Johnson would be captured, tortured, broken. He'd betray Bumpy, reveal the heroin shipment, offer to help Vance coordinate the raid in exchange for protection and money. Vance would believe him because Raymond's fear would be genuine, because the intelligence matched what Vance was hearing from other sources, because it confirmed everything Vance already believed about colored criminals being inferior and easy to manipulate. 4. The message. Vance would die with his entire team in what appeared to be an ambush by rival criminals, probably Italian mob figures protecting their heroin territory. The evidence would make clear that Vance had been conducting an illegal operation, stealing drugs rather than arresting dealers. Any serious investigation would expose massive police corruption and clan infiltration. The department would choose cover-up over scandal, would classify Vance's death as criminal activity unrelated to his police work, would bury everything to protect their reputation. "This works, or we all die," Prophet Washington said flatly. "One mistake, and we're finished." "I know," Johnson said. "That's why I'm asking for volunteers." Around the table, every man volunteered. Not from courage, from understanding that some crimes demanded response even at the cost of everything they'd built, that 2 burned children mattered more than survival, that there came a point where being men who allowed such things to go unpunished was worse than dying. "Then we start tomorrow," Johnson said. Raymond gets grabbed Tuesday. Prophet finalizes the mill by Thursday. Theodore makes sure the evidence trail points away from us toward the Italians. And Christmas Eve, Henry Vance learns that terrorizing Harlem carries costs he never calculated. December 21st, 1948, 1:30 a.m. Raymond Johnson walked out of Small's Paradise nightclub drunk enough to be convincing, sober enough to maintain control. He'd spent 3 hours being seen by dozens of witnesses, spending money freely, celebrating something unspecified, creating the impression of a man who had good news. The men who grabbed him did so efficiently. A car, 3 men, 7 seconds from street to back seat. Blackjack to the kidneys, fist to the face, arms twisted behind his back. No witnesses willing to admit they'd seen anything. They took him to a warehouse in the Bronx. In a basement room lit by a single bulb, Captain Henry Vance waited. Vance was 51, going soft but still dangerous, wearing civilian clothes but carrying absolute authority. 2 officers flanked him, Sergeant O'Malley and Detective Schmidt, both Klan members, both willing to do whatever violence the situation required. "Raymond Johnson," Vance said pleasantly, "you're going to tell me everything about Bumpy's operations, or my associates will hurt you in ways that make you eager to talk. And if you still don't talk, we'll move to people you care about. Your mother, your sister, that girl in the Bronx. Understand?" Raymond nodded, genuinely terrified despite knowing this was planned, because being in a room with Henry Vance was genuinely dangerous, because getting this wrong meant real death. "Good. I've been hearing rumors about a heroin shipment coming into Harlem soon. You know about it?" Raymond stayed silent 6 seconds, long enough to suggest resistance, short enough to avoid immediate violence. "I don't know what you're talking about." Vance nodded to O'Malley, who drove a fist into Raymond's kidney. Raymond gasped, doubled over, felt genuine pain radiate through his back. The beating continued for 6 hours, carefully calibrated to hurt, without causing damage that would prevent talking. They broke his nose, blackened both eyes, split his lip, cracked ribs. Between blows, Vance asked questions Raymond denied answering. Then, exactly on schedule, Raymond broke. "All right," he sobbed, blood running down his chin. "All right, I'll tell you. Just stop." His confession came in fragments, interrupted by gasps. 5 million in heroin, arriving Christmas Eve, abandoned textile mill on East 135th, maybe a dozen guards, vulnerable for 3 hours before distribution to safe houses. Then Raymond delivered the hook. "But you can't raid it officially. Bumpy's got cops on payroll, politicians who'll warn him. You come at him through channels, he'll know before you arrive. You'll find an empty building." He paused, seemed to decide something. "But if you hit it off books, just you and men you trust, no warrants, no authorization, you catch him completely by surprise. You seize the drugs, kill everyone present, make it look like a gang dispute. No one ever knows cops were involved. And you walk away with 5 million in heroin that no one can report stolen." Vance's eyes shifted from satisfaction to calculation. Raymond could see him recognizing exactly what was being offered, not just a bust that would make him a hero, but a score that would make him rich, that would destroy Johnson while profiting enormously. "You're suggesting I steal the drugs," Vance said carefully. "I'm suggesting you take advantage of an opportunity. I'm suggesting that sometimes the law gets in the way of justice. And I'm suggesting that if you do this, I want protection and 50,000 to disappear." Vance studied Raymond's swollen face for 30 seconds, looking for deception. But Raymond's performance was flawless. The fear was genuine. The desperation was genuine. The injuries were genuine. And the story made perfect sense. "Deal," Vance said finally. "You help me take down this shipment. You get 50,000 and protection. But if you're playing me, what happened tonight will seem gentle. Clear?" "Crystal clear," Raymond whispered. As Vance left, Raymond slumped in his chair, playing the role of a broken man who'd betrayed everything. Through the pain of genuinely broken bones, he felt cold satisfaction. The trap was set. In 3 days, Henry Vance would walk into darkness he'd never escape. December 24th, 1948, Christmas Eve, 10:28 p.m. The textile mill stood dark against the snow, surrounded by frozen, empty lots, isolated from the nearest occupied building by 300 yards. Inside that darkness, 40 men waited in positions they'd rehearsed for days. Prophet Washington crouched on the 3rd floor in absolute black, surrounded by 10 men armed with shotguns and Thompson submachine guns. They'd spent the past week learning this space blind until they could navigate as confidently in darkness as in light. On the 2nd floor, 15 men occupied positions around holes cut in the floorboards, covered now with weak boards that would collapse under running men's weight. On the main floor's center, 20 wooden crates marked with Marseille shipping labels sat stacked, appearing unopened, obviously containing something valuable. They contained 50-pound bags of powdered sugar. Bumpy Johnson stood in the basement next to the electrical junction box controlling the temporary lighting system. Beside him stood Marcus Thompson and Silent Jim Crawford, both armed with shotguns, both positioned to secure Johnson and escape through basement tunnels if anything went wrong. At 10:28 p.m., Prophet gave a low whistle from the 3rd floor. Vehicles approaching. Everyone tensed. Captain Vance sat in the lead vehicle of 7 cars and 2 trucks, watching the textile mill as his driver approached without headlights. Behind him, 30 men, all police officers officially, all soldiers in a private army for tonight, prepared for what they believed would be the easiest $5 million they'd ever steal. Vance had presented it as justice, as cleaning up Harlem more effectively than courts ever would, as seizing drugs that would otherwise destroy colored communities. Which was true enough. The part he'd omitted was that he planned to sell the heroin himself, that this operation would net him personally several million. But that was the beauty of being a white police captain operating against colored criminals. You could commit any crime as long as you blamed the right people afterward. The vehicles stopped 50 yards from the mill's entrance. Vance climbed out, joined by O'Malley and Schmidt. Raymond emerged from a trailing vehicle, face still swollen from the beating 3 days prior. "That's the main door," Raymond said quietly, pointing. "Not locked. Heroin's on the main floor, probably center where they've got space. Security around the perimeter, maybe 12 men, probably pistols and shotguns." "How do we know they're still there?" O'Malley asked suspiciously. "They're there," Raymond said with certainty that came from knowing it was true. Not because there was heroin, but because Johnson's men waited in darkness exactly as planned. Vance nodded. "We go in fast. Schmidt, 10 men through main entrance. O'Malley, 10 men through east loading dock. I'll take 10 through west window. Hit all 3 simultaneously. Trap them center. Kill anyone who resists. 5 minutes maximum. Questions? None. No survivors, Vance emphasized. Everyone dies. We can't leave witnesses. This needs to look like rival dealers hitting Johnson's operation. Clean, quick, total elimination. At 10:31 p.m., 3 teams moved toward the textile mill from different directions. Prophet Washington watched through a gap in boarded third-floor windows as 30 men approached the building, dividing into 3 groups. He gave 2 quick whistles. Signal confirmed. Everyone in position. Below him in the basement, Bumpy Johnson's hand rested on the electrical junction box switch, waiting. The main entrance door opened. Schmidt and 10 men entered, flashlights cutting through darkness, guns raised. They moved cautiously but confidently, trained in room clearing, sweeping the main floor. Loading dock door crashed open east side. O'Malley's team entering. West window shattered. Vance's team climbing through. 30 men now inside the textile mill. Flashlight beams crisscrossing darkness, converging on the center where wooden crates sat stacked. "There!" Schmidt shouted, spotting the crates. "Center floor. That's the heroin." All 3 teams rushed toward the crates, abandoning caution for greed. 30 flashlight beams focused on the target they'd come to steal. In the basement, Bumpy Johnson flipped the switch. Every light in the textile mill blazed on, dozens of bulbs on all 3 floors. Sudden, overwhelming illumination that blinded men who'd been using flashlights, that froze them in place, squinting against the glare. For exactly 3 seconds, the mill was brightly lit, long enough for Prophet Washington and his 10 men on the 3rd floor to acquire targets. Long enough for Vance's men to look up, confused, starting to realize this wasn't right. Long enough for Bumpy Johnson to flip the switch again. The lights died. Absolute darkness returned, deeper and more disorienting than before, because their night vision was destroyed, because they'd been staring at bright lights and now saw nothing but purple afterimages. And in that darkness, Prophet Washington's team opened fire. Thompson submachine guns roared from the 3rd floor, spraying the main floor below with .45 caliber rounds that didn't require precise aim in darkness, that just swept areas where Vance's men had been standing when the lights died. Men screamed. Flashlights dropped and shattered. Someone returned fire blindly upward, bullets ricocheting off steel beams. "Bat Gen Pin Len," Vance shouted. "Get lights up." Several men fumbled for flashlights. The moment a beam stabbed through darkness, it became a target. Shotgun blasts from the 3rd floor killed whoever held the light. O'Malley tried to organize a retreat toward the loading dock. Fall back to a Molotov cocktail arced through darkness from the 2nd floor, trailing flame, smashed against concrete near O'Malley's position. Gasoline ignited, creating a wall of fire that cut off the east side escape route. More Molotovs followed, thrown from positions Vance's men couldn't see, creating pools of fire that divided the main floor into isolated kill zones lit by flickering orange light that revealed targets without providing enough illumination to return fire effectively. Schmidt ran north, trying to reach the main entrance. The floor collapsed under him, weak boards giving way, dropping him 12 feet into the basement where Silent Jim Crawford waited with a knife. Schmidt's scream cut off abruptly. 3 men tried to climb stairs to the second floor, trying to reach the shooters above them. Steel cables strung at neck height clotheslined 2 of them, nearly decapitating them, their bodies crashing backward downstairs. The 3rd made it to the second floor landing, where he was shot point blank by men he never saw. Detective Frank Schmidt's brother, Officer Kenneth Schmidt, emptied his pistol, shooting at muzzle flashes from the 3rd floor. "I can see you, you fuckers! I can—" A noose dropped from the darkness above, settled around his neck, jerked tight. Kenneth Schmidt was hauled upward, legs kicking, hands clawing at the rope, pulled 15 feet into the air, where he strangled slowly, while men below him died in darkness and fire. Vance crouched behind an overturned crate that provided 0 actual cover, trying to process what was happening, trying to understand how this had gone so catastrophically wrong. Around him, men were dying, not in a gunfight, but in a slaughter, picked off one by invisible attackers who controlled the terrain and the darkness and the fire. "It's a trap!" someone screamed unnecessarily. "It's a fucking trap!" More Molotovs, more walls of fire. The main floor was becoming an inferno that provided light, but trapped everyone in smaller and smaller areas. O'Malley tried to rally 10 men near the loading dock. "Form up, suppressing fire on 3. 1, 2. Drums of gasoline positioned above them on the second floor were tipped over, pouring 50 gallons of fuel onto the men below, soaking them. Before they could move, a lit road flare dropped into the puddle. 10 men became human torches, screaming, running blind, crashing into walls and each other, lighting other men on fire through contact, creating a nightmare of burning flesh and agonized screaming that echoed through the mill. Vance abandoned the crate, ran west toward where he remembered a window, moving through smoke and darkness, guided by the faint outline of fire behind him. He crashed into something, a steel support beam, stunning himself, fell backward, rolled, came up disoriented. A flashlight clicked on directly in front of him. In its beam stood Bumpy Johnson, holding a shotgun aimed at Vance's chest. They were perhaps 10 feet apart, Johnson's face illuminated from below by the flashlight giving him a demonic appearance. Vance on his knees, weaponless, surrounded by the screams of his dying men. "Captain Vance," Johnson said quietly, his voice somehow audible through the chaos. "You like fire. You burned 43 sleeping children. 2 of them died screaming for help that never came. Sarah and Thomas Reynolds, 7 and 9 years old." Vance lunged for Johnson, going for the shotgun. Johnson sidestepped, brought the shotgun stock down on Vance's head, dropping him. Vance fell, dazed, blood streaming from his scalp. Johnson reached into his coat, pulled out a Zippo lighter. Even through smoke and chaos, Vance could see the inscription on its side. "Unity Orphanage, Hope for Tomorrow. Dr. Hayes found this in the ashes," Johnson said. "One of the children owned it. Somehow it survived the fire you set. Somehow it waited 3 weeks to find its purpose." Johnson dropped the Zippo next to Vance. Then he picked up a jerry can of gasoline positioned nearby, one of dozens Prophet had placed throughout the building, and poured its contents over Vance's chest, back, legs, soaking him completely. Vance tried to crawl away, slipping on gasoline-slick concrete. "You can't. I'm a police captain. You'll hang for this," "They'll hunt you." "They won't," Johnson said calmly. "Because you came here to steal $5 million in heroin. Because you brought 30 corrupt cops on an illegal operation. Because investigating your death exposes police corruption and Klan infiltration at the highest levels. Because the department will cover this up rather than face that scandal." Johnson picked up the Zippo, flipped it open, struck the flint. The flame caught, steady and bright. You asked Dr. Hayes if she understood that next time could be all 43 children. You threatened to burn 41 more to keep her quiet. Well, Captain, tonight you learn what happens when someone actually follows through on burning people alive. Johnson tossed the lit Zippo onto Vance's gasoline-soaked body. Vance ignited instantly, flames erupting across his torso and legs, his uniform catching fire, his hair burning. He screamed, a high, agonized shriek that rose above every other sound in the mill, and tried to run, tried to pat out flames that wouldn't extinguish, tried to escape pain that had no escape. He made it perhaps 20 feet, stumbling blind through fire and smoke before collapsing. His screams continued for another 40 seconds, diminishing gradually to whimpers. Then, silence. Bumpy Johnson watched until certain Vance was dead. Then he turned and walked toward the basement stairs, where Marcus Thompson waited to escort him through the tunnels to safety. Behind him, the textile mill burned, consuming the bodies of 31 men who'd come to commit a crime and found themselves victims instead, erasing evidence, creating the chaos necessary for the cover story that would follow. December 25th, 1948. Christmas morning, 6:47 a.m. Fire crews arrived at the textile mill at 5:23 a.m., called by residents 3 blocks away, who saw flames. By the time they controlled the blaze, the building's upper floors had collapsed into the basement, creating a mass grave of burned timbers and unidentifiable human remains. Police arrived at 6:15 a.m., By 6:47 a.m., they'd counted 31 bodies in various states of incineration, found shell casings from multiple caliber weapons, identified the remains of gasoline drums and Molotov cocktails, and discovered wooden crates containing bags of what initial testing suggested was powdered sugar. At 7:30 a.m., a detective found Captain Henry Vance's badge in the debris, partially melted but still identifiable by its number. At 8:15 a.m., the police commissioner arrived on scene personally, looked at the carnage, looked at his subordinates, and made a decision. "This is a crime scene," he announced. "Organized crime dispute between rival factions. Appears to be a drug deal gone wrong, possibly involving Italian mob figures based on the sophistication of the ambush. No indication that any police officers were present or involved." A detective spoke up carefully. "Sir, we found Captain Vance's badge. We found badges belonging to Detective Schmidt, Sergeant O'Malley, and at least 6 other officers. There are 31 bodies here, and early identification suggests most were NYPD. The commissioner's expression didn't change. Those badges were stolen months ago in various incidents. The fact that criminals were carrying stolen police identification doesn't indicate actual officers were present. Any suggestion otherwise would be speculation unsupported by evidence. But, sir, are you questioning my assessment, Detective?" Silence. "The official finding is that this was an organized crime incident," the commissioner repeated. Approximately 31 criminals, identities unknown at this time, died in what appears to be an ambush related to narcotics trafficking. Captain Henry Vance is listed as missing, possibly kidnapped, under active investigation. Anyone who contradicts this official finding will be disciplined for spreading false information that damages department reputation. Are we clear? Around the crime scene, officers nodded reluctantly, understanding what was being ordered, understanding that truth mattered less than protecting the institution. By noon, Christmas Day, newspapers across the city carried the story. Massive gang violence in Harlem, 31 dead in apparent drug war. Captain Vance was mentioned in a separate article as a decorated officer who'd gone missing under mysterious circumstances, possibly kidnapped by criminals seeking revenge for his aggressive anti-crime initiatives. No connection was made between the missing captain and the 31 burned bodies. Officially, those were separate incidents entirely. December 26th, 1948, evening. Dr. Charlotte Hayes stood in the cemetery where Sarah and Thomas Reynolds had been buried 10 days earlier, looking at two small headstones that read simply, "Beloved children, gone too soon." Bumpy Johnson approached from behind, stopped a respectful distance away. He didn't speak, just stood beside her in the cold, looking at the graves. After a long silence, Hayes spoke. "I read the papers. 31 criminals dead in a gang dispute. Captain Vance missing, possibly kidnapped. No connection suggested between the events." "That's what the papers say," Johnson confirmed. "Is it true? The official story?" Johnson was quiet for a moment. "No, it's a lie. But it's a lie that protects the truth from being investigated, that prevents follow-up, that lets everyone involved pretend nothing happened beyond what they're willing to admit happened. Sometimes the best outcome isn't truth being told. Sometimes it's truth being buried so deep that no one ever has to acknowledge what was necessary." Hayes turned to look at him directly. "Did Sarah and Thomas get justice, Mr. Johnson?" "They got vengeance," Johnson said. "Which isn't the same thing as justice, but it's all that was available. The man who killed them died screaming the way they died screaming. His associates who helped him died too. And the system that would have protected him was forced to cover up his death rather than investigate it. Which means every other white man in a position of power who might consider burning more buildings understands that sometimes crimes carry costs the system can't prevent." "Is that enough?" Hayes asked. "No," Johnson said honestly. "It won't bring them back. It won't change the racism that created Henry Vance. It won't fix the broken system that let him murder children without consequences, until someone outside that system imposed consequences anyway. But it's what was possible. And maybe the next Henry Vance thinks twice before lighting that match, remembers what happened to his predecessor, chooses not to follow that path." Hayes looked back at the graves. "I asked you to kill him. I asked you to make it hurt. And now I'm standing here wondering if that makes me a murderer too. If asking for violence makes me as bad as the people I wanted punished." "It makes you human," Johnson said quietly. "It makes you someone who loved children enough to seek vengeance when justice wasn't available. Whether that's right or wrong isn't for me to judge. I'm a criminal doctor. I deal in violence and corruption because that's the world I operate in. You're a doctor who saves lives. The fact that you were willing to cross that line for Sarah and Thomas doesn't make you a monster. It makes you someone who understood that some crimes are so awful that normal rules don't apply." He paused, then added, "But you need to make peace with that choice, because you're going to carry it the rest of your life. You're going to wonder if you did the right thing. You're going to have nightmares about the 31 men who died because you came to me. And you're going to have to decide whether saving 41 other children from future fires was worth the blood on your hands. Hayes was silent for a long time, standing in the December cold, looking at two graves that represented everything she'd tried to prevent, everything she'd failed to save, everything she'd sacrificed her moral certainty to avenge. Finally, she spoke. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson, for doing what needed doing, for making Henry Vance pay, for proving that colored children's lives matter even when the system says they don't." Johnson nodded once, turned, and walked away through the cemetery, leaving Dr. Hayes alone with two graves and a terrible certainty that justice and vengeance were sometimes indistinguishable, that righteousness and murder could occupy the same act, that there were no clean answers when the choice was between accepting atrocity and becoming monstrous yourself to prevent future atrocities. Behind him, Hayes knelt in the snow between two small headstones and wept. For Sarah and Thomas, for the 41 children who'd survived, for the 31 men who'd died in fire and darkness, for Henry Vance who'd burned screaming, and for herself who'd asked for that burning and would carry the weight of that asking until her own grave received her. The story of what actually happened. Christmas Eve, 1948 never appeared in newspapers, never became official history, never was acknowledged by anyone in authority. Captain Henry Vance remained officially missing, his disappearance attributed to kidnapping by criminals. The 31 bodies found in the textile mill remained officially unidentified organized crime figures. But within Harlem, within the colored community that had watched two children burn and a police captain smile about it, the truth spread through whispers and knowing looks and stories told in barbershops and church basements. They said Bumpy Johnson had killed Henry Vance. They said he'd done it in darkness and fire. They said he'd made Vance scream the way Sarah and Thomas had screamed. They said 30 corrupt cops died with him. They said the NYPD had covered it up rather than face the scandal of investigating honestly. And they said that after Christmas 1948, white officials in positions of power were noticeably more careful about how they treated Harlem's residents, noticeably more reluctant to use violence casually, noticeably more aware that terrorism against colored people sometimes carried costs that couldn't be prevented by badges or political connections or institutional racism. It wasn't justice in any legal sense. It was something older and darker and more permanent than law. The ancient certainty that some crimes demand blood payment, that some evil must be met with equal evil, that predators sometimes learn caution only after they become prey. Sarah and Thomas Reynolds remained dead. Nothing could change that. But their deaths stopped being meaningless the moment Henry Vance discovered that burning children carried consequences even when the system refused to provide them. That was the lesson Harlem taught Christmas Eve, 1948. That was the trap that closed in darkness and fire. That was the justice that came not from courts, but from a criminal who understood that sometimes protecting the powerless required becoming more terrible than those who preyed on them. And in the years that followed, when white officials considered whether to terrorize Harlem's residents, some of them remembered Captain Henry Vance and his 30 corrupt cops burning in an abandoned textile mill, and they chose differently, not from virtue, not from justice, from fear, from understanding that the trap was still there, still waiting in darkness, still ready to spring closed around anyone foolish enough to believe that colored lives could be taken without consequences. I really want to know, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your city or country in the comments. This story has reached readers on every continent, and I'm always amazed by how far these legends travel. Drop a comment, share this story. Let's talk about it. If this story of the bloodiest wedding in Harlem history hit different, drop a like and subscribe. See you in the next one.